Good morning, all of you. Great to see all of you here. I'll try to make up for the little bit of lost time, and then Joe Stiglitz will start us off. In America, a serious schism has developed, France and Britain too, of course. The working class, especially those in Appalachia and the Midwest, feel frustrated with the meagerness of their wage gains, made worse by the immobility that state welfare programs and home ownership have brought, by the fall in real interest rates on whatever they have saved, and the byproduct, sky-high housing prices faced by young workers. They blame this development on what they see to be a meritocracy that for decades has neglected them. For Mark Lila and Francis Fukuyama, the mistake of the meritocracy was its narrow focus on serving some interest groups and not serving others as well, such as the working class, also known as the Trump base. Another mistake of the meritocracy, it said, was its failure to grasp the importance of the slowdown of total factor productivity that set in around 1970 and to address it. Few economists wrote about it, notably Oscar Lindbeck in 1983 and Stan Fisher in 1988. In my view, this failure has cost the country not only the slowdown of wage rates among a group whose wages were already low, it has slowly eroded job satisfaction and the prospect of engaging careers. Most worrying, it has put an end to widely shared prosperity, which Torben Iversen and David Soskin argue is the stabilizer that serves to keep democracy intact. Resulting crisis is bringing new ideas that must be acutely interesting to any research center on capitalism. Many observers and politicians question whether people should put up with the hardships and anxieties brought about by the economy as currently structured, and they wonder whether redesign of the economy could alleviate the insecurity. On the left, new socialists call for more government ownership or operation of some industries, such as the healthcare industry. In the center, the new progressives call for regulatory reforms, such as regulation of large tech, of high-tech companies. On the right, the new nationalists advocate protecting nationals from immigrants and imports regarded as choking off jobs and approve massive tax cuts as a way to restore prosperity to the nation's industry. We academics worry about the unanticipated consequences, in Robert Merton's immortal term, of instituting novel initiatives. If companies were required to benefit the community more and investors less, what would be the effect on their incentive to create new businesses? And what would be the effect on the experience of work among employees? What would be the effect of socializing health care on the amount of taxable capacity left to meet other goals, such as Rawlsian economic justice, and such as designing education to inspire young people to pursue the good life? How much of the economic justice and the voyage of discovery that at one time or another America deemed of the highest importance ought the nation to give up for the sake of the agendas of socialists, progressives, and nationalists? I can't help notice that most of the calls for reforms and new initiatives firmly believe that it is the economy that needs fixing, but what if the deterioration of society is the problem? What if the weakness is a weakness of dynamism among the people, not a non-optimal resource allocation? These are some of the questions posed in this, the Center's 17th Annual Conference. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm the first speaker, and I'm going to be talking about a concept that I call progressive capitalism. I suppose if I were giving this talk in Europe, I'd have another name like social democracy, but this is for an American audience. And it's a little bit of an advertisement for this book, which I encourage you all to read and maybe buy. So what I want to do is lay out my interpretation of what has gone wrong. I'll try to describe what's gone wrong, and very briefly how to fix it. Let me first begin by defining what I mean by progressivism. It's just the belief that progress is possible, and it is within our power to construct an economic and social system that advances progress. And when I use the term progress, I mean in a very broad sense. Obviously, as an economist, I begin by talking about sustainable increases in standards of living, including life expectancy. But it also means living within our planetary boundaries. You know, figuring out how to do that is part of progress, and we aren't doing that now. And so I don't embrace necessarily that we have to have more and more material goods. It also embraces advances in our notions of social justice. That you might say that there was a progress between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you know, an eye for an eye, into broader senses of tolerance. And those concepts of tolerance and liberalism, I view as a key ingredient to progress. In the economic area, these advances were made possible by science. They were advances in our understanding of the world around us. And I'll illustrate the implications of that. It's also by advances in social sciences, our understanding of who we are, what is the nature of human nature, and advances in social organization. In primitive agriculture, you only had to organize the farm and the market of where people traded. Advanced societies are far more complex. You have large organizations, and you have large organizations dealing with each other in complex ways. So there have been complex advances in our understanding of organizations, and among that are ideas like markets governed by rule of law. Some people don't seem to understand that. And democracies governed by separation of powers, by checks and balances. These are not obvious ideas, but over 250 years, we've really come to understand them more broadly. And all of these, historically, you can think of as growing out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in itself grew out of other changes, so I'm not going to do a historical review, but it was the Enlightenment in many ways that set the stage for the progress that we have today. Now, just in terms of the narrow economics, it's important. The next set of curves illustrate how much things have changed. Data going back hundreds of years are obviously not fully accurate, but this gives you a picture done in a whole variety of ways. I'll give where until 1750 there was no changes in standard of living. There were little wiggles. If you look carefully, you'll see the bubonic plague did mean that there was a scarcity of labor, and per capita income did go up a little bit, but not much. And then it went down. The big change, as you see in that hockey curve, hockey stick, is around 1750, 1800, around that, for Western Europe, and then it spread to the rest of the world. And you have to ask the question, this is the big change in economics, and what brought this about? The next slide shows similar data for the UK, real wages of craftsmen. They have a real penchant for collecting data, and you can construct things, and you get exactly the same pattern. Data on life expectancy is done from a different source and has a different degree of accuracy, but you see the same kind of pattern, enormous increases in life expectancy since 1820. So the basic ideas of what I want to go through, this is a really big thing, is what is the source of wealth of nations? Adam Smith wrote about that, but he wrote about that before the advent of the Enlightenment. He was at the beginning of the Enlightenment, so he couldn't look back and talk about what was the source of wealth. He was talking about the pin factory. A modern economy is not a pin factory, and differs. The innovation economy, a service sector economy, totally different from what Smith was talking about. But as I'll say in a few minutes, he got some things right. He understood how businessmen, women, well, men then, never got together without conspiring against the welfare of other people. They never got together without conspiring against the welfare of workers and to suppress their wages. And they always did it in secret, just like Apple did. So it was quite remarkable. If you read, it was the playbook of Apple today. So, and Amazon. So there's a lot of insight, but it wasn't about the structure of the economy. It was the behavior of people, and that was the human nature. So I'm going to talk about what is the source of the wealth of nations. I've already given a flavor of what it is. But the real thing I want to talk about is the confusion between what makes individuals wealthy and what makes a society wealthy. Individuals can get wealth, society gets wealthy by adding to the national pie. Individuals can get wealthy by stealing from other people. And they can steal from other people in a whole variety of ways. I'm not going to call it stealing, I'm going to call it exploitation. But we have been enormously clever. Our strongest innovation has been in methods of exploitation. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Economists use a more technical term. They call it rent seeking, not much more technical than that. But the US, to a very large extent, has become a country of rent seekers. And there's a trade-off. If you spend more time in rent seeking, you're not going to do as much in wealth creation. The result of this, there have been dire consequences for our economy, our society, and our politics. And these dire consequences are reflected in the slowdown of growth that Ned talked about, and into increasing inequality manifested in many, many ways. Things are likely to get worse unless we change our economic model. And so that's why I put forward this idea of progressive capitalism. It provides an alternative economic model to the existing arrangements with at least the prospect of making things better. So it's not an oxymoron. Some people on the left say progressive capitalism is an oxymoron. I don't think that's right. I think basically what I'm arguing is that any well-functioning economic system is going to have to be based on a new social contract, and that's going to be between the market. Markets are going to play an important role, and I'm using markets in a very, very abstract way, the state, civil society. And I use the word capitalism to remind us that the market plays a central role, but I use the word progressivism to remind us that it is not unfettered capitalism. Capitalism is not an end in itself, but a means to broader societal objectives. We know what it was like in the unfettered capitalism that we had, say, in New York State 100 years ago, and the labor conditions were terrible, there was exploitation, women burned up in factory fires, and it wasn't a very nice kind of capitalism, and it wasn't until we tempered it that it began to work for ordinary citizens. I also want to acknowledge that successful society must be based on a rich ecology of institutional arrangements. We shouldn't forget that we are here at Columbia in a organization which is neither for-profit nor public. It is a foundation. You can call it not-profit. We model how it behaves, but it's certainly not a state institution. It's not a for-profit. The only in education we know the only not for-profit institutions are things like Trump University that excel in exploiting other people and in fraud and in all kinds of things like that. That's what private for-profit institutions at the university level have systematically done. So we have important co-ops. The only part of our financial system that worked well in the Great Recession were our co-op, our credit unions. So we have a rich array of institutions that we ought to cultivate. One of the things that speaks to the issue that Ned hinted at in his introductory remarks is the nature of the institutions in which we're embedded affects who we are. And that we unlike standard economics where we assume that people are born with their preferences, with their behavior, we are shaped by our society and we shape our society. It's a two-way relationship. And capitalism, materialism, shapes people to be more selfish. And we were at a conference over the weekend where there are a whole set of papers talking about how teaching economics does succeed in making people more selfish. And we make our students like our models, but embedding people in cooperative relationships changes them also. So when we think about our economic organization, we have to think about how they affect individual behavior and societal behavior. For lots of the main problems our society faces, collective action is required. And we think of collective action on the part of government, but there are lots of other kinds of collective action. For instance, collective bargaining, class action suits. And a lot of what is going on is a war to try to change the balance between collective action and restrain it, because those with a lot of power don't want ordinary people to get together to balance that power. And so that is one of the main dimensions. Now that number 727, is that the amount of time I'm supposed to have left? No. So I'm going to talk a little over that. I'm going to use the power I have right now to talk just a little bit over time. Okay, so what is the source of the wealth of nations? It's the creativity of the people, investments, especially in the advances of science and technology. You wouldn't think you would have to remind people of this, but the President of the United States has proposed a cut in science budget of 1/3 for the country that's supposed to be leading the world in science. And the second important point I emphasized already, the institutions which enable them to cooperate together to do more than anyone could do alone. All of these require assessing the truth. And one of the real concerns I have of this particular moment in our history is the assault on all of our institutions of truth. None of our institutions that have led to the advance of science, of our standard of living that I described before, that enormous thing, science, social organization can function without some institutions to assess the truth. And to me, this may be the most dangerous aspect of what has happened in the last few years. And this is, as I say, a perspective that's somewhat different from that of Adam Smith, simply because he was at a different point in time. And as I said, there's a major confusion between what makes a country rich and what makes an individual rich. And there are, if you look at the data, a large fraction of the very wealthy are based on exploitation. The people who discovered DNA, they're not on the very rich. the people who discovered the transistor or the laser, all the things that have transformed our society, none of them are on our very rich list. So it is very, and conversely, a lot of the people who brought on the 2008 crisis, who had a negative social contribution, are on that list. So they succeeded in taking money from the rest of the people, and they wound up with a lot of money. This is really important for understanding two interpretations of the distribution of wealth that have gone on for 200 years. Are those at the top a result of the adding to the size of the pie? That's the marginal productivity theory. Or are they people who've been very successful in exploiting others? And what I'm saying is, to a large extent, exploitation. The two are mixed together. Microsoft may have added something. They found somebody else who had developed an operating system, but the real contribution is how to make that operating system monopoly and exploit monopoly rents. That's where the real rents came from. So there are many forms of exploitation. My early work was on exploitation in form of taking advantage of asymmetric information. There's exploitation and using modern behavioral economics and finding people who are vulnerable. Our firms are really excelled in doing that, detecting vulnerabilities and knowing how to extract rents out of that. What I'm going to talk about, and I think Lina will talk about, are market power. The growth in firms that have market power. And it's overwhelming, the evidence of this increase in market power in our economy. And this focus on market power helps explain many aspects of the US economy. Let me talk about a few of them. One of them is there have been it has contributed to inequality. It helps explain the low level of investment. It helps explain a number of the other conundrums in our society. So let me just go through some data on how our economic system has not been serving most individuals. And when I say, GDP is not a good measure of economic performance, and economic performance should be assessed on how well it does in working for most people. So this is a standard chart. There are similar ones. I'm not going to defend it. There's some that show things much worse than this. But this looks at what's happened to incomes over the last 45, 50 years. The line that's at the bottom is not the horizontal axis. It is the average income of the bottom 90%. If you have a microscope, you can see that there's been some increase in income of the bottom 90%. But the top 1%, you don't need a microscope. What can you see from that? They've done very well. I didn't play with the statistics. You all know that you can play with statistics. I could change the axes. These are what we call natural numbers, the numbers as they ground out. And by putting them on the same, you see what has happened in our society. Europe has done better, but the patterns are there. Not a surprise of some of these things, because one of the things that's happened is the share of labor has gone down. What's really dramatic is if you take out the top 1% of workers, the top 1% of workers are not workers as you and I understand it. There are guys, the bankers who are on the golf course, the CEOs who are on the golf course, you can call them workers. They get a W-2, they get paid, but they're more accurately described as rent seekers. Take out those 1%, and you look at the wages of the bottom 99%. Their share of national income has gone from around 75% of GDP to national income to 60% of GDP. That's a 15% decline, percentage point decline in a relatively short time. The next graph shows it hasn't always been this way. This is a graph that Piketty made famous that Kuznets talked about the share of the inequality going down. That was true until around the mid-70s, at the same time where dynamism started slowing down, and then inequality started rising. The next curve shows the standard diagram of the disconnect. It wasn't as if America's workers got less productive. Their productivity continued to grow, but there was a disconnect between compensation and wages. There are a number of other puzzles, manifestations of this inequality. I talked about inequality income. Very strongly ingrained in America is the notion of equality of opportunity. But the life prospects of young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced country. So the American dream is really a myth. We don't have good data to know whether it was always a myth, but it is very clearly, on the current data, a myth. We have poverty traps, but there are also, for us, lucky, there are rich traps. If you're born at the top, you are more likely to remain there. A child of a rich parent who does poorly at school is more likely to have a higher income than a child from a poor family who does better at school. So it's very clear that there are problems of this kind. There are many other manifestations of this inequality. One that has gotten a lot of attention is Angus Deaton and Ancase and Angus Deaton have emphasized the fact that life expectancy in the United States has been on decline every year since Trump became president. And key to that are these deaths of despair. Suicides, alcoholism, drug overdose. And the only time I saw anything like that was at the dissolution of the Iron Curtain, fall of the Berlin Wall, where society collapsed. And that's what we're seeing in parts of the United States. There are other puzzles, like, there are growing profits, yet, as we conventionally measure it, but low investment rates. And not only is the share of labor down, but even the share of capital, if you measure it in any appropriate way, is down. If the share of labor is down, share of capital is down, what's up? Rents, monopoly rents, exploitation rents. So that is basically, this, in a nutshell, what has gone on. America has become a country, a society, an economy of rent seekers. And the result of this is that there is a justified discontent with our economic situation. And for a whole variety of reasons, the problems may be getting worse. First, the changes in technology are what sometimes described as Hicks described as labor-saving innovation. That means wages are likely to get lower, and especially unskilled workers. And secondly, we are not living within our planetary boundaries. And that means that the problems of climate change are going to really affect us in the not-too-distant future. So what is the answer? I called for this idea of progressive capitalism, harking back to an earlier period when abuses of our political and economic system became intolerable. We succeeded at that time in creating a more dynamic capitalism and a prosperity that was better shared. And there are just four elements of this, and I won't have time to go through the details, but one is rewriting the rules of the market economy. Economists sometimes act as if markets exist in a vacuum, that they're just abstract rules, but we write down rules, and including the rules of antitrust, competition policy, and we'll have a discussion of how Europe and America have changed those rules in ways that have led more competition in Europe and less competition in the United States. Corporate governance, big issue being discussed right now. What should be the objective of the firm? Milton Friedman, a superb ideologue, used his position of having gotten a Nobel Prize to advance an ideological position that firms should maximize their shareholder value. As he was doing that, there was no science in support of his view. Sandy Grossman and I had written an article showing that shareholder capitalism, shareholder maximization, did not lead to societal well-being. He was not interested in that. He did not refute it, he did not respond to it, nor did anybody else, because it was correct. But the fact was that he was more influential than my papers in the QJE and in other journals. He went out and persuaded lawmakers to change the law. And we got shareholder capitalism. One of the reasons why things haven't worked, they kind of built in short-termism into our economic structure. It's interesting now that we are beginning to win this particular war because the vast majority, almost unanimous CEOs of the Business Roundtable about a month ago said we ought to go back to stakeholder capitalism, a broader view. They didn't mean it. They were just responding to an assault on the consequences of shareholder capitalism, the opioid crisis, the fact that the soft drink companies are leading to an epidemic of childhood diabetes, the financial companies that exploited people in a whole variety of ways. The capitalism wasn't working in so many ways. They took a defensive reaction, but when I say rewriting the rules of capitalism, I'm talking about every aspect of our labor, corporate governance, every aspect of our legal framework. So that's the side you won't see. An important part of this is the rules that protect us from destroying our environment. And regulations have gotten a very bad rap. If you think about it for a minute, those that live in New York City, if we didn't have stoplights, we would be in gridlock all the time. Stoplights are a regulation. They say who can go first and then who can go. And it is only because we have stoplights, regulations, that we are able to function as a city. And if we didn't have regulations about the environment, we would be in the Dickens era. So that's the first. The second is we need systems of progressive expenditures, the investments in technology and infrastructure, education, that make a well-functioning society work. The third is they have to be financed somehow, by progressive taxation. And the good thing is we have lots of opportunities of raising revenue, taxing bad things like short-term speculative capital, pollution. We have lots of revenue by making our tax system fairer, making capital pay the fair share of taxes, eliminating step-up of basis. So we have lots of potential getting trillions of dollars to create through progressive taxation that would make our economy more efficient and finance the progressive expenditures. And finally, even doing all this, which will, I believe, lead to a more dynamic and a fairer society, won't suffice to ensure the middle-class life for most Americans. And we need a whole set of programs, which might be called a 21st century welfare program, which I describe in my book, and if I had some more time, I would describe here. And so let me just summarize. A new course is needed. The old economic model has failed for over 4 decades. You can think of the Reagan experiment in the United States, Thatcher, neoliberalism. These were experiments. And when they didn't work in the beginning in the way that promised, people said, well, you didn't give it a time. And they doubled down on the experiment. We now have 40 years of this experiment, and we can say that experiment was a dire failure. And we really need to abandon it. And what I've tried to lay out here is the idea that mild tinkering is not likely to make matters much better. Some people say, well, we got to get an education system a little better. If we just bash the unions a little bit more, let's double down and get rid of teachers' unions. All those things are not going to make the fundamental difference. What is required is major changes, and what you call it is not important. What is important is what we do. And that's where I call for a new social contract, a new economic order based on a new relationship between the market, the state, and civil society, which I think can produce greater growth with more equality and address the climate and equality crisis that we are now confronting.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the Center for inviting me. Great. I should note before starting, I'm currently on leave from my academic work, working instead with the House Antitrust Subcommittee, but my comments today reflect my own views and not those of the subcommittee. So I'm going to be picking up on some of the themes that Joe laid out, but with a particular focus on antitrust and anti-monopoly. So antitrust and anti-monopoly have reemerged as key pillars of a progressive agenda in recent years, and I'm going to briefly talk about why I think that is, what it looks like, and where it could go. So it's no secret that we are living in a moment of historic levels of economic concentration. Empirical studies show that competition has declined and market power has increased across markets. This is true not just of major sectors like the airlines, telecom, and healthcare, but also in much more obscure parts of our economy, ranging from seeds and poultry to mattress manufacturing and waste management. Increasingly, concentration looks to be a systemic rather than an isolated feature of our economy. So why does this matter? As Joe noted, there's been empirical research in the last few years connecting growing market power to an increase in markups, increased income inequality as well as regional inequality, labor's falling share of wealth alongside stagnant wages. Thomas's research has shown that corporations are underinvesting relative to profitability and funding costs. So this period of growing concentration has coincided, in addition, with a sense that our lives are increasingly subject to forms of private government, or what Professor Frank Pasquale has called the functional sovereignty of concentrated private power. Needless to say, several factors have contributed to this state of affairs, but one key component is the intellectual revolution in antitrust law that took place around 40 years ago. So antitrust laws were passed at the federal level in 1890, and these have been preceded by a disparate set of antitrust and anti-monopoly laws at the state level. So when passed at the federal level, these laws really had a strong Republican orientation. The legislative history strongly suggests the lawmakers were motivated by a desire to protect liberty and democracy from concentrated private power. So when passing the Sherman Antitrust Act, Senator Sherman noted, if we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessities of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade. Similarly, a few years later, when passing the Clayton Antitrust Act, one of the senators noted, we are trying to keep the highways of opportunity unobstructed. We are trying to keep it so that the feet of the men of today may travel along an open path so that all may have a fair chance to gain a livelihood and to embark in business. So we really get a sense of some of the themes that motivated the passage of the federal antitrust laws. For the several decades into the 20th century, antitrust laws were enforced with this Republican set of values in mind, what could be called an anti-domination orientation. So enforcement was informed by institutional economics and applied a form of structuralism, which included policing for size as well as for certain forms of conflicts of interest. Starting in the 1970s, however, antitrust started undergoing the Chicago School Revolution. The Chicago School Revolution broadly rejected structuralism and adopted price theory based on a faith in self-correcting markets, kind of followed the mantra of what exists is ultimately the best guide to what should exist. And there were various assumptions that underlay this shift. One of the key ones was that market power is eternally disciplined by the threat of entry and is therefore largely benign or, if abused, fleeting. It's really difficult to overstate what a significant impact this idea has had in antitrust, in part because it has meant that enforcers greatly fear false positives or erroneous enforcement, and have a preference for under-enforcement, basically systematically. In practice, this revolution was also embodied by the embrace of the consumer welfare standard. So Robert Bork, hugely influential in antitrust in 1978, published The Antitrust Paradox. One of the lasting contributions was his revisionist legislative history, which argued that the only goal that Congress was seeking to promote with the federal antitrust laws was consumer welfare, which he defined as allocative efficiency, though over the subsequent decades it's been reinterpreted. At its base, what this shift meant was that we changed from assessing competition as a process to assessing competition as an outcome. And this shift has had huge ramifications for our analysis of predatory pricing, of vertical integration, and of cross-ownership, where concerns had fundamentally been about market structure. So there are many ways to describe this shift from what I call a Republican theory of antitrust to a neoliberal theory of antitrust. But I think one of the most illuminating ways to understand is to focus on the dramatically different theories of power that underlie these distinct approaches to antitrust. So I want to focus on two disparate Supreme Court statements. Here is a dissent written by Justice Douglas on behalf of 4 members of the Supreme Court. So this was the case where the Justice Department had sued to block an acquisition in the steel industry. So dissenting, he noted, power that controls the economy should be in the hands of elected representatives of the people, not in the hands of an industrial oligarchy. Industrial power should be decentralized. It should be scattered into many hands so that the fortunes of the people will not be dependent on the whim or caprice, the political prejudices, the emotional stability of a few self-appointed men. The fact that they are not vicious men, but respectable and social-minded is irrelevant. This is the philosophy and the command of the Sherman Act. It is founded on a theory of hostility to the concentration in private hands of power so great that only a government of the people should have it. Contrast this with a majority opinion written by Justice Scalia in 2004 in a case alleging anti-competitive conduct by Verizon. He wrote, "The mere possession of monopoly power and the charging of monopoly prices is not only not unlawful, it is an important element of the free market system. The opportunity to charge monopoly prices, at least for a short period, is what attracts business acumen in the first place. It induces risk-taking that produces innovation and economic growth. To safeguard the incentive to innovate, the possession of monopoly power will not be found unlawful unless it is accompanied by an element of anti-competitive conduct." So Justice Scalia wrote this opinion on behalf of 6 justices in what would ultimately be a 9-0 opinion. And I think through these opinions, we get a glimpse of how starkly the underlying conception of economic power has changed. So in Justice Douglas's account, economic power is inextricably political, and he offers a positive vision of how economic power should be organized, which itself is founded on the basic idea that forms of economic power are not inevitable and instead can be restructured through law and the rules that Joe was talking about. In Justice Scalia's account, by contrast, monopoly, it's kind of an ode to monopoly power here. You know, he says that monopoly power is not just unthreatening, but in fact is actually beneficial and desirable, as well as the product of market forces, kind of gesturing at this inevitability. And so I think, you know, we really see how this shift has been founded on a changing understanding of the role of economic power and the role of monopoly power. It's worth noting that this opinion was joined by Justice Breyer and Justice Ginsburg, which tracks a broader trend in antitrust, which is that liberals actually played a pretty key role in legitimizing and codifying some of the ideas initially offered by the Chicago School. There was a productive tension at points, but at critical moments you had the Chicago School and the Harvard School, which included Justice Breyer, jointly narrowing the zone of liability and making it ultimately more difficult for anti-monopoly laws to be able to tackle monopolies. So what would it mean to re-anchor antitrust in its founding values? So some of the scholars and practitioners that are leading this project are loosely being called the New Brandeis School. Last year, I wrote a piece sketching out what some of the key tenets of this school seem to be. The first is the recognition that anti-monopoly is a key tool and philosophical underpinning for structuring society on a democratic foundation. So this rests on the idea that self-government hinges on the capacity of citizens to control and check public and private concentrations of power. Madison advocated designing government with checks and balances to promote distribution of public power, and anti-monopoly laws governing markets seek to extend the same logic to the private sphere. A second key principle is that the anti-monopoly tradition is comprised of more than just antitrust law. So antitrust has a critical role to play, but because it is at root a law enforcement regime, it operates through establishing liability and bad conduct, and it is ultimately limited in the role that it can play as a policy tool separate from enforcement. Instead, there is a vast set of anti-monopoly levers embedded across federal, state, and local government, ranging from how GSA structures procurement policy to whether a city permits municipal broadband. These are policy levers that can really shape the structure of competition separate from antitrust enforcement. And the goal of these anti-monopoly levers ultimately is to structure markets and to structure private power to promote democratic ends. Today, anti-monopoly has largely been reduced to antitrust law, but to give a sense of how historically anomalous this is, I wanted to share a congressional report I came upon from the 1950s. This is a report called Congress and the Monopoly Problem, 50 Years of Antitrust Development from 1900 to 1950. And it's broadly a history of actions Congress took in the first half of the century. And this is the first page of the table of contents. And what was really striking to me when I came across this was how many different laws were categorized by Congress as laws designed to address the monopoly problem. So today, when you talk to antitrust lawyers, they really just point to three statutes, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Acts. But here what we see is that provisions of the Wilson Tariff Act, the Federal Reserve Act, the Commodities Exchange Act, the Natural Gas Act, critical labor laws like the Norris-LaGuardia Act, these were all laws that were seen as foundationally about structuring private power. And I think, not just for policing bad conduct, but ultimately for structuring markets and access to markets. A third tenet of the emerging New Brandeis School is that embracing anti-monopoly cannot be reduced to big is bad, which is, I think, sometimes a caricature their critics offer of the New Brandeis School. So traditional anti-monopolists like Brandeis recognize that certain industries tend towards monopoly. This is especially true of network industries, where there can be significant economies of scale and benefits to preserving a large network. And so in these instances, the answer is not necessarily to break up firms, but instead to design a system of regulation that prevents firms from abusing their monopoly power. This may include non-discrimination provisions, like the type that were applied to railroads and until recently to ISPs. And again, I think this underscores how the Anti-Monopoly Toolbox is not just a one-size-fits-all approach, but is instead about a framework and a set of principles that, depending on the market at issue, can look different when applied in different contexts. Lastly, a key approach of the New Brandeis School is to focus on structures and processes of competition rather than outcomes. So the Chicago intervention to focus on consumer welfare has distorted antitrust in a variety of ways, but I think one of the major ways is that it has blinded enforcers and courts to focus primarily on promoting efficiencies and blinding them to the other exercises of market power that antitrust is also charged with policing, including, for example, the effects on producers and workers. The Chicago School introduced consumer welfare partly on the grounds that giving antitrust this single welfare-based goal would help bring rigor and coherence to antitrust. But the fact is that in practice, consumer welfare seems to have led antitrust astray even on this one metric. So for all its purported determinacy, there is no uniform, widely held, agreed definition of consumer welfare, which we're seeing play out in some of the current debates. Some recently have been arguing that consumer welfare is capacious enough to encompass worker welfare and harms to labor, whereas you have others arguing that it should connote allocative efficiencies in the ways that Bourne had intended. Others are arguing instead that we should be focused on consumer surplus. And I think it's productive that this debate is happening, but I think it does ultimately highlight how consumer welfare has not actually delivered on its promise of grounding antitrust in a single. I think a second metric on which consumer welfare has failed is in delivering low prices. So there have been a set of empirical studies in recent years that have documented how mergers approved by the antitrust agencies have routinely led to price increases. Economist John Quokka's work in particular is especially compelling on this point. 3/4 of the transactions that he studied were found to have resulted in price increases, some of which were quite significant. And I think this is an area that invites further study, but on its face, it does suggest that the consumer welfare framework is in fact failing on its own terms to keep prices from increasing after mergers and in light of anti-competitive conduct. I'll also add that I don't think rejecting consumer welfare is the same as seeking to use antitrust to promote a whole set of social goals like more jobs or less inequality, or we need a whole set of regulatory interventions, some of which Joe described, to achieve a progressive agenda in total. But I do think that there is a difference between observing that increased concentration can have economy-wide effects and arguing that those effects should explicitly govern in antitrust analysis. I think those are two separate things, and I think one effect of the Chicago School Revolution was that many effects of economic concentration just stopped being studied at all. I remember a few years ago, I was interested in understanding what research existed, looking at the potential connection between market concentration and inequality. And at that time, this was in 2013, the most recent study that had been done on this topic was from the 1970s by William Comenor, which is really stunning because it showed how refocusing the goal of antitrust really just, I think, made us blind to the other ramifications that excessive market power can have. I think refocusing antitrust on structures and a broader set of measures to assess market power can return the law to focusing on the competitive process, which I think is ultimately the best, is both most faithful to the legislative history, and I think the best approach to actually promoting competition. So in closing, I see anti-monopoly as a framework for recognizing that the structure of our economy is the product of legal choices and design choices. And anti-monopoly in particular helps identify the range of tools available to structure our markets. I will say, just in closing, I think this is a remarkably exciting time in antitrust. I think it hasn't been since the 1912 presidential election that antitrust is now firmly part of the presidential campaign. And it'll be really exciting to see what the coming years hold. Thank you.
So thank you very much to the Center for inviting me here to discuss. So officially I'm Joe's discussant, but actually I think we're all discussing each other. So what I thought I would do was first to focus on the issue of market power, and also play by my comparative advantage, which is data and numbers. So I'm going to show you the data and the evidence that we have on whether or not there is an issue of market power in the US. Okay, so let's start with the basic figure number one. So this is one measure of concentration. You should know that this is actually much more controversial than you might think. That it's not so easy to show that market power has increased because you need to take a stand on many details, and the details matter. So here it's broken down by two broad sectors, manufacturing and non-manufacturing. Manufacturing is in circles, non-manufacturing is in triangles, and the data is, this plots the cumulative change over time. Okay, so it starts at 0 because that's the first data point I have. Okay, and then the axis on the left is in percent, and the number that's shown is CR8. So there are two ways to measure concentration. One is the Herfindahl index, and the other one is concentration ratios. And usually they give you the same qualitative picture. CR8 is the top 8 firms' market share. So if you take a market, if the top 8 firms have 40% of the market, CR8 is 0.4. So this is showing that CR8 went up by about 8 percentage points over the period of time from the last 30 years roughly. So if it started at 0.4, now it's at 0.48. Okay. So the question then is that a big number or a small number, and how confident are we that we are measuring this market properly? You need to decide what's the right market. You need to put a firm in a particular market, a particular industry when you do that, and that's controversial. But people have done it in many different ways, and I think broadly speaking, we all find that there is some increase in concentration, both in manufacturing and non-manufacturing. The thing that we don't know, much of the debate is about what does that mean. So there are two big questions, in fact. One is it good or bad concentration? The second one is it technology or policy? So I'm going to try to give you some evidence on both questions. Good or bad concentration? Well, that's because there are many examples where concentration is really good. So if you look at the boom of the 1990s, almost half of the TFP growth during the boom of the 1990s was in retail trade. Okay. Fully a quarter or a third of the entire increase in standards of living in the 1990s came from retail and wholesale trade. Two sectors that had wide increasing concentration. Okay, that was a good type. That was the Walmart style concentration, which in terms at least of efficiency and productivity was extremely beneficial. Okay, that's not to say, but there might be some other issue with Walmart on the labor side. But in terms of pure productivity gains, low prices and higher productivity, that was the whole story of the it was like literally almost the whole story of the 1990s. So that's good concentration. And it typically comes to some form of return to scale and some investment in intangible, and it leads to productivity gains. So the question then is, do we see these productivity gains in the sectors that today are driving the concentration? The bad type of concentrations are the ones linked to barriers to entry. So industries where the rents, like Joe was saying, the rents are protected by barriers erected around the industry to prevent competition from outside. So obviously in the US, telecoms today, airlines, healthcare. But then the question becomes, what are these barriers? Okay, and then the second connected question is it policy or is it technology? So the fact that we see rising consumption today, is it because the technology has changed and it's efficient for the firm today to be more concentrated? So you hear that story a lot in the tech business. So is it driven by intangible assets and network effects? Or is it, like Lina was saying, regulation and antitrust? Okay, so that's what we're doing. So the first one, good or bad concentration? The answer is both, as you might expect. So it depends where you look. So the first thing to understand is it's widely heterogeneous across industries. Today, there are still industries where you see some signs of increasing returns, where concentration is probably good, and you see many industries where it's probably bad. So what I've tried to do with some of my co-authors, this is from the NBR macro newspaper, is we try to look at about 12 measures of signs of concentration, whether it's good or bad. So we look at whether firms are getting concentrated, whether prices are going up or down, whether productivity is going up or down, whether they're investing a lot in intangible assets, whether they are lobbying a lot. So all these kind of measures, you aggregate them up and you come up with two measures. One is the one we call intangibles, because it loads heavily on intangibles. And typically it's a signal that it's a good type of concentration. The other one we call barriers to entry, because it comes together with either heavy lobbying or not, just no entry, essentially. You see this data where industries make lots of profits and you don't see new firms entering. That's a sign that something is wrong. So the statistics then allow you to kind of create two big measures. One is highly correlated with what we think of as bad concentration. The one is the one that in theory should proxy for good concentration. And this time series there show you the prevalence of the two types, the two measures over time. So what you can see is that during the 1990s, most of the concentration was associated with the intangible type, good style concentration. In other words, most of the industry that we saw driving concentration in the 1990s, they did invest a lot, they grow a lot, their productivity growth was pretty good. And the green line doesn't go to zero, so there's still some of them today. Okay, so it's not as if every industry that is concentrating in the US today is bad type concentration. Okay, there's still some of the green. But you can see since 2000, a very strong pickup of the other one, which is, broadly speaking, across all industries, you see more of the type of concentration where it comes together with higher prices, higher profit, less entry, and not so much investment. Okay? Which is the hint that maybe some of the concentration we see today is more of the bad type. Okay, one way you can also zoom in here is to look at investment. So much of my research on that actually was motivated by the lackluster performance of investment. And so here, that's a very simple picture, which I think is relatively convincing. So what we do here is you remember the first graph I showed you, this is for the whole US economy. Now imagine you do this kind of calculation industry by industry. So you look at the industries where concentration went up the most relative to industries where it went either didn't go up or it was flat. Okay, and then you compute the gap in investment. So we have some models that predict how much investment there should be based on essentially funding cost and profitability. And in the aggregate, we know there is a gap, which is today you have low funding costs, high margins, high stock prices, and despite this, the level of investment is lower than anywhere in the past. And if you break down this gap in the aggregate at the industry level, what you see here is the gap is entirely driven by the green line, which is the industries that have become more concentrated. While industries that have flat concentration, we don't see an investment gap. They invest at a level which is consistent with fundamental theory. That suggests that, it is true today that if you ask yourself, why is it that we don't see that much investment? The answer is it's coming from concentrating industries. And that's also consistent with the idea that over the past 20 years, maybe we see more of the bad type of concentration. Okay, so I think there is a reasonable case that, at least over the last 20 years, we have a higher prevalence of the bad type concentration relative to the good type concentration. Then the second question is it policy versus technology? There is no way you can know by just looking at the US because it's all mingled. What you can do, however, is look outside the US, because outside the US you might find some industries that have exactly the same technology as in the US, but happen to have different regulations. So if they have different concentration dynamics, then maybe you're going to learn something. That's what I did when we studied with my co-author in details what happens in Europe. So at the aggregate level, this is the picture for Europe. So this is CR8 in the US. This is the average. This is actually North America. It includes Canada. So this is the growth of CR8 over time in the US. Remember, roughly on average going up by about 8 points. And this is CR8 in Europe. So there's a little bit of a trend, but it's smaller. Okay, it's much flatter. So that's telling you right away that the rise in concentration is not universal. Okay, it's stronger in the US than in other parts of the world. And if you start digging in the data to figure out why is it different in some other region, well, it's because we tend to have more pro-competition policies in Europe today than in the US in many industries. And that's, to me, that was one of the biggest surprises when I started doing this research, which is I didn't expect that. Because I still had the mindset of the 1990s where every textbook, every summary article, every OECD report was like, okay, the US has the best regulation, everybody should do the same. And that regulation was free market, low barriers to entry, and free market. And at the time, people didn't think seriously that this would change. But it changed in two ways. Surprisingly enough, the rest of the world started to listen. Even though it took a long time, the US policymakers and the OECD and various other global organizations did manage to convince people outside the US that indeed free markets worked. And so we started doing free markets in Europe. Of course, the funny thing is this was all inspired by the US in the 1990s. And the prime example to me in France is, I have many more examples in my book, but this one I find pretty striking. This is a very simple, you can construct that data in 5 minutes online. You go to the World Bank, you get what we use for PPP data, so the comparison of prices around the world, and you download the series for price of telecommunication in France relative to the US. Okay, that's it, that's all there is to it. So what you see here is a broad index of communication services was about 10 to 15% more. So this is the ratio of the price. So 1 means the same price. 1.1 means it's 10% more expensive in France. So you see that this basket of telecommunication services was about 10 to 15% more expensive in France until 2011. And then from there on, it dropped to being almost 30% cheaper. Now that's a 40% drop in relative price in 2 years. This is massive. And that's not a small industry, that's the entire telecommunication sector. So what happened? One thing, we gave a forced license to a company to operate. There was an oligopoly with 3 firms, 3 legacy carriers, and we finally gave the license to Free, that's the name of the company, Free Mobile, who entered that market in 2011, and they entered the market with a price which was 40% below than every other competitor. So within 6 months, all the incumbents had to match that. And today, that's why literally cell phone services are less than half the price in France as in the US. And the same happened in the UK, the same happened in Germany, the same happened in Korea, the same happened in Japan. So all of these countries today, people on household on average pay half of what you pay for your cell phone. The same, Lina mentioned the ISPs. The same happened with the ISPs. Today, broadband internet per megabyte is more than twice. So it's exactly the price in France today is $31 per month on average for broadband internet access. It's $68 per month in the US on average. Okay, 31.68. So it's not 10% more, it's 100% more. Okay, that's all came from deregulation. And then that tells you an interesting story, because if you look around the world, the only country where regulations have been going up is the US. Now, of course, what happened is starting from a very low baseline, because remember, the US was the land of free market in the 1990s, so the baseline level of regulation was very, very low. In fact, that's when the US convinced the rest of the world to move towards that model of free market. Since then, other countries, Europe, much of Asia, starting from a very high level of regulation, started to go down, at the same time as the US, starting from a low level, starting to go up. Okay. And so what you see here is one of these measures of regulation creeping up in the US. If you do that plot for any other country, regulations go down. And not surprisingly, when you have more barriers to entry, you have less entry. So that's a measure of restrictions to entry across all industries, and that's the actual entry rates of new businesses. Okay. This is for the aggregate, and then of course you can do it at the industry level and find that industries with more quickly increasing barriers to entry tend to have more quickly decreasing entry rates. The last thing you find when you look at the data around the world is that the way these things are sustained is not by chance, it's by lobbying. Okay? And in fact, that also explains a lot of what we see today. And that's even more striking in the case of Europe. Because the one thing the Europeans did in the 1990s when we decided to set up our antitrust and market regulation system, we did 2 things. The first one is we took US ideas of free market and we just put them into our law. That's the first step. But then we did something else, which at that time nobody thought was important. We made the regulator completely independent. And the only reason we did that is because we couldn't agree on anything else. Because the French didn't want the Germans to influence the regulators. The Germans didn't want the French to influence the regulator. The Italians wanted nobody to influence the regulators except for them. So everybody wanted to have, their own influence without the other countries being able to influence. Well, then the only thing you could agree on is fine, let's make that guy completely independent. So nobody can influence them. So that's the Nash equilibrium, like we would say in economics. It's a bit strange, but that's the paradox, but that's the thing that happened, and that's the reason we have a more independent central bank and more independent regulators, because we had to agree on something, and that's something we could agree on. But because of that, we've created completely by chance regulators that are much more immune to lobbying than in the US. And you've seen this over time. So lobbying expenditures in the US now are much, much higher. And by the way, the data since then, because they changed the regulation, the reporting requirement, I'm sure it's here, but the data is not so good anymore. So this is lobbying expenditure in the US relative to Europe. So it's a ratio of like 4. And the last thing to conclude is, because I'm a numbers guy, so I like to know how things add up. So at the end of the day, suppose you take all of our best estimates of all of these things we've been talking about and you put them into a big macro model, how much money are we talking about? Okay. What's the number? So I'm going to give you 3 sets of numbers. So the first one is, if I look at prices in the US and I benchmark them by prices in other countries that have the same level of GDP per capita and have different regulations, then my estimate is that prices are 5 to 10% too high here on the typical basket of the typical household. The typical household spends about $4,000 per month. I think they spend $300 extra because of that. So every household, the median household, I would say, in the US should have $300 extra at the end of the month because prices are too high here. If you aggregate that up across all households, that's about 600 billion per year. Okay, that should be saved just by lower prices. But then, of course, we know from the work that economists have done, actually, Joe, of course, is a contributor to that literature when he was young. Well, he's still young, but. So, so we know that in equilibrium, like if you make markets more competitive, it doesn't stop there. You don't have only lower prices. What you have is the whole system starts to change, because when firms compete, their incentives change. They have to produce more, they have to lower prices, they have to hire more, they have to invest more. And these second round effects are typically much more important. So if you put them together, my estimate is as follows. Suppose we could turn the clock back to 2000. So we will take the US today, and just all you do is you move it back to the degree of competition in US market you had in 2000. Then GDP would go up by about $1 trillion, labor income by about $1.25 trillion, and therefore profit would go down by about 250 billion. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm sorry I don't have any slides. I've always been of the view that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Progressives have evidently made antitrust and competition policy a key component of their platform, and that's what I'll speak about this morning. I think a confluence of factors led us here. Obviously, at the academic or intellectual level, there's the ongoing undercurrent debate about measured national concentration, limitations or perceived misapplication of antitrust, which I'll touch on later. I think, though, we should also recognise there's broader kind of anti-capitalist feelings after the financial crisis at play. I think the blaming of the tech companies for facilitating or perceived to facilitate Donald Trump's election, and very other issues that are kind of less economics focused, privacy, freedom speech, surveillance, and more. I think there's also, despite Lina's attempts to convince us otherwise, there is an anti-big impulse. And I think it manifests itself most obviously with the tech giants, where the critics seem to move seamlessly from rationalizations about how these companies' activities are anti-competitive to then saying that their bigness is actually inevitable given economic phenomena, so they must be regulated. So in all cases, we need some regulation or increased antitrust because of the size of these companies. Now, let me start by saying where I agree with Lina Khan's big picture take. I think both her and Professor Stiglitz are correct in saying that the intentions of the original antitrust legislation went far beyond the current consumer welfare interpretation. I think there clearly are more structuralist anti-monopoly impulses in the original legislation. And when you read the judgments about protecting small dealers, worthy men, I think it's also clear from reading the Supreme Court cases that the role of antitrust was not perceived to just be about consumers, as Bork famously reinterpreted. But for so-called progressives, harking back to the authority of old legislation is a peculiar talking point. Where else do progressives want us to be constrained by historical legislative intent? And I think in embracing that kind of originalism, they actually ignore, or at least downplay, that the consumer welfare standard was actually adopted as an evolution in antitrust thinking, based upon pretty detailed work at times on industrial economics, not just that realised that the old structuralist model delivering arbitrary and often anti-consumer outcomes. So I think turning back the clock, I'm not saying that's what Lina wants to do, but that argumentation leads to the idea of turning back the clock, which I think would be a retrograde step. My second area of broad agreement is I think that antitrust almost by definition tends to be focused on short term. I think sometimes progressives over-egg the extent to which the consumer welfare standard focuses on just price and output. If you look at mergers between 2004 and 2014, just shy of a third of the mergers challenged by the FTC were on innovation grounds. But they're surely correct, the progressives, that antitrust tends to concentrate on short term. And there's a simple reason for that, which is that, as Friedrich Hayek warned us, there's a massive knowledge problem with speculative analyses of markets. Not least, we don't know how technologies product markets or consumer demands will evolve. And that means the conclusion that the progressives take, that antitrust should be structuralist to account for potential harms or potential market dynamics from near-term pricing strategies, vertical integration, or platform favoritism, just doesn't follow. In fact, I think history shows the exact opposite. It's precisely because we don't know the technologies and business practice and how they'll evolve in delivering better outcomes that it's a mistake for antitrust or regulatory competition to extrapolate from current business practices to assume long-term dominance. And if you look back to the period when antitrust was much broader in its interpreted remit, this type of speculative analysis about the potential to cause harm often led to pretty terrible anti-consumer judgments. And I think that's because it ignored the key margin of competition highlighted to us by Joseph Schumpeter, that of creative destruction, the kind of unforeseeable development of whole new business practices, models, or jumps in product quality. And I think this is especially important today because in industries where innovation really is a key component of dynamic competition, especially the tech sector, I think the structuralist approach taken by Lina and others would have assumed monopoly explanations for business practices which not only enhance both competition and consumer welfare, but were subsequently actually overturned by new business practices and products, and so didn't entrench market power by observed case studies. In my paper, Is This Time Different?, I actually look back at firms operating in very similar industries to today's tech companies themselves were accused publicly, sometimes through the courts, of acting anti-competitive. Their business practices, some of these supposed structural advantages we hear about. And what I found was history is actually replete with tales of insurmountable network effects, economies of scale, vertical integration, predatory pricing, unfair bundling or tying, data advantages, and in almost all cases, the worries about entrenched monopoly didn't. Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, which just like Amazon, was accused of harming local economies and sole proprietors, engaging in predatory price cutting, giving preference to its own products over those of rivals within its marketplace, i.e. its stores, and monopsony power over wholesalers and suppliers. They were dragged through the courts, famously found guilty of breach, violation of the Antitrust Act. Congress passed the Robinson-Patman Act, trying to ban the consumer-friendly deals that they're able to negotiate with suppliers. And yet, did it all matter? Well, no, not really, because chain stores' dominance was transient anyway. They themselves were about to be disrupted by big box warehouse supermarkets, television, promoting national brands. Then we saw stores embedded within shopping centres, non-grocery products in supermarkets, and of course, Walmart with IT, big data, and revolutions in logistics. So how would a structuralist antitrust agenda have dealt with all of those issues? What impact might a more structuralist approach have had on the likelihood of incentivizing other firms to consider those kind of transformative business innovations? Now, people today, of course, worry about network effects in relation to Facebook, Google. Yet network effects are nothing new either. AOL used to be considered an impenetrable monopoly because of network effects in instant messaging. 40 companies at one stage asked the Federal Communications Commission to encourage AOL to open its network to them as part of its merger with Time Warner. Since then, of course, we've seen the rise and fall of MSN Messenger, MySpace, now we've got WhatsApp, iMessage, Facebook, GChat, WeChat, Snapchat, and Slack. AOL's AIM, simply got blown away by innovative new competition. Would that innovation have played out if AIM had been considered an essential facility and all other firms been given access to its network? Don't really know. As late as 2010, Microsoft was, of course, still dominant in the browser market with Internet Explorer. Economists and legal scholars thought that in a mature sector, where websites had already optimized their use for that browser and most people owned PC Microsoft operating systems, that those indirect network effects would represent an insurmountable barrier to entry. Then, of course, along came Firefox and Chrome and Safari with better products. Is it not a worry that antitrust, on a structuralist sense, might have actually deterred better products or services if one wasn't able to compete for most or all of the market from the first place? Remember the hand-wringing about Apple's bundling of the iPod and iTunes, whereby songs bought from iTunes could only be played on the iPod. Just as with the App Store and iPhones today, Apple itself actually innovated using that bundle. Would a process antitrust have enforced unbundling early on? Would it have deterred investments in the music industry? And would it have considered the entry of subscription services into the sector? Now, the point that I'm making here is not that markets are always efficient or that companies are incapable of anti-competitive action. My argument is that history suggests markets are not perfect, but trying to correct them and trying to perfect them is possible too. And the progressive conceit, in my view, is to place too much faith in legislation, courts and regulators to be able to manage a structural antitrust agenda in improving on market outcomes. As we see, it's already difficult enough with the imperfect and short-termist consumer welfare standard to achieve that outcome, let alone trying to use antitrust to trade off a whole range of other concerns, or at least assume them through a structuralist model. A specific example, I think, comes today in digital platforms, which Lina has written a recent paper where she extols the idea of structural separations, or at least non-discriminatory dealings in online marketplaces, search or social networks. Now, a cynic might say that her aim of that paper is for us all to enjoy the same innovation levels in tech as we currently experience from our electricity, telephone or sewage services. But I disagree fundamentally with Lina that Amazon or Google ads are essential facilities or necessary infrastructure for companies. But think about it retrospectively. Just imagine what forced separations would have meant in existing sectors if they'd applied ex ante. You might have iPhones that couldn't pre-install apps, making them by and large just phones. Why would Apple have invented so much in technologies and many of the apps that come as standard as we receive and use today at no marginal cost to us? Amazon would not have been able to engage in any of the practices actually undertaken by ordinary retailers in regard private labels or product placement. Google wouldn't be able to direct you to its map service when you were clearly searching for your address using its search engine, a product that is provided at no out-of-pocket cost to consumers, cross-subsidized by its digital advertising revenue. Or Alexa might have had to host multiple different operating systems. You'd have to go online to download. Why would anyone have produced the smart speaker? Would we have seen Google Home if that had been the case? We really think such a world would have led to the heavy investments and the kind of rich tech ecosystem we see. Would eliminating that bundling have been good for consumers? Would we have seen such dynamic competition? I think to ask those questions answers them. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there are sectors in the US economy where there are real, often government-created barriers to entry which undermine both competition and consumer welfare. I fully agree with Joseph Stiglitz in his book about airlines and healthcare. So add to that banks, car dealerships, and many others. I think Thomas is clearly doing very important work on the example of telecoms, and I do think there's something we can learn from European regulations those sorts of large and significant industries. But when you look at the options enjoyed by most consumers and advertisers today in most sectors, they do seem to have more choice, at least in many product markets, than ever before. Indeed, new research that I've seen recently in the past year increasingly rejects the kind of crude, high-level concentration studies suggesting competition is diminishing, and seem to suggest that national concentration in many sectors may be increasing, but driven by large productive companies who harnessed IT, servicing more relevant local markets. So even though at a very high level it seems that concentration is increasing, if you look at the much more localized relevant market levels, consumers seem to have more choice. opening across every local area. It may be the case that at a national level that shows up as an increase in concentration, but at a very local level, consumers now have more options than they did. And I just suggest on that policy at an EU level, I'd argue, has been quite effective in reducing concentration. But in some sectors, that has come at the clear cost of dynamism. Europe is not a dynamic economy by any means, believe me. I lived there for a very long time. Now, tech companies, again, have massively increased options for many sellers, advertisers, and users and customers. They invest very, very heavily in R&D. In 2018, Amazon spent $28 billion in R&D. They're continuously diversifying into new product markets, competing with each other to serve the low ends in many of those sectors. And they themselves outline fears of being disrupted. Now, if these tech companies, the accusation is that they capture politics, I'd argue that the current debates we see should knock that one on the head straight away too. So let me just sum up. I mean, the central irony, I think, of the progressive agenda is this. They do want us to move from an imperfect yet relatively clear outcome-focused model of consumer welfare, in part because it's considered too static. But the sort of antitrust and regulatory thinking they proposed, divorced from those consumer outcome concerns, extrapolating from current business practice to assume dominance, I think actually risks dampening the dynamic created destruction margin of competition that matters to us most. In saying that you value process over outcomes, you're explicitly saying that you're willing to tolerate higher prices and less innovation in the aim of protecting markets looking a preconceived way. And we can do a lot of hand waving and suggesting that we can get the double dividend and we both improve outcomes and improve process. But that's hugely speculative. I think it'd be better for everyone and honest if they were to admit or at least conceive that there was a trade-off between these two.